Located between Athens and Sparta, on the narrow piece of land connecting the Peloponnese with the Greek mainland, lies the city of Corinth. Although the current settlement located by the sea dates back to just 1858, the original city a few kilometers inland can trace its beginnings well into prehistory. According to legend, it was founded by and got its name from a man called Corinthos, said to have been descended from Zeus. However, the geographer Pausanias claims that this story was only really taken seriously by the Corinthians themselves, since the city was in early times also known as Ephira, the same name as one of the daughters of the god Oceanus. Another myth attributes its foundation to her. Others still say that its founder and first king was Sisyphus, the son of Aeolus, king of Thessaly. Supposedly, he managed to bring great prosperity to his new city, but was also a ruthless and deceitful ruler who took pleasure in killing his opponents. If you recognize his name, it's probably because he was forced to for all eternity roll an immense boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down again whenever it nears the top. The gods gave him this punishment partly for trying to cheat death, and partly for daring to think that he was even cleverer than Zeus himself. If we look at the archaeological evidence, we see that the site may have been occupied as early as 6500 BC. Over the years it developed into an important center of trade, but seems to have been destroyed around 2000 BC. A couple of centuries later it probably became the site of a palace city, much like those of Tiryns, Pylos or Mycenae, but it remained more or less a backwater up until the 8th century. In 747, the last king of Corinth, Telestes, was overthrown by his own clan, the Bacchiadae, who from then on would rule the city as a group by annually electing a Prytanis, equating to the position of king, and a Polemarchos to head the army. During their time in power, Corinth emerged as a major Greek city. Large public buildings and monuments erected, and in 733 its first colonies were established at Corcyra or Corfu and at Syracuse in Sicily. By 730 BC, the population had grown to what was then a fairly impressive size of at least 5,000, several hundred of which would belong to the ruling clan. But by the mid-7th century BC, the days of the Bacchiadae were counted. Due to discontent caused by recent wars, the Polemarch Cypselus could have them overthrown and installed himself as the first tyrant of Corinth. During his 30-year rule, temples to Apollo and Poseidon were built, and his enemies were expelled to found new colonies for the city. According to Aristotle, he had promised to offer the entire property of the Corinthians to Zeus if he became the master of the city, and according to the story at least, he kept his word. Cypselus was succeeded by his son Periander, who along with people like Thales of Miletus and Solon of Athens, is considered one of the 7 sages of Greece. Under him, Corinth became one of the wealthiest of the Greek city-states and founded colonies at Potidaea in northern Greece and Apollonia in Albania. It also conquered Epidaurus and its old colony of Corcyra, which had retained a strong sense of independence and was often at odds with its mother city. It's actually in an earlier war with them that the first ever recorded sea battle took place. Much of the wealth that now poured into the city was due to an ambitious infrastructure project. Periander had tried to take advantage of the city's strategic position on the Isthmus of Corinth by digging a canal through it. This would attract more trade by sparing merchants the dangerous trip around the Peloponnese, but either due to its great costs and lack of labor or to technical difficulties, the project was abandoned. Instead, he created the Diolkos, a paved trackway which allowed boats to be moved over land and which would remain in use until the 1st century AD. With the tolls from the increased trade, Periander constructed a number of temples and public works and promoted literature and the arts. He is said to have both written and appreciated philosophy and invited the poet Arion from Lesbos for an arts festival in the city. It's also now that the first Corinthian coins were struck and a distinctive Corinthian style of pottery was developed. Now, despite the flowery picture that this might paint of Periander, he is actually referred to by several, although not all, ancient writers as a cruel and harsh ruler. According to one story, he once kicked his wife or threw her down a set of stairs so hard that she was killed. Because of this, his son Lycophron decided to leave Periander and seek refuge in Corcyra. But in old age, he decided that he wanted Lycophron to become the next ruler, and managed to convince him to come home to Corinth, although only on the condition that Periander go to Corcyra. However, the Corcyrians heard about this and killed Lycophron to keep away Periander. Instead, it was his nephew, Psammetichus, who became the next and last tyrant of Corinth in 585 BC. He was named after the Hellenophile pharaoh Wahibra Psamtik I and stayed in power for just 3 years until being replaced by a council of 80 oligarchs. It's thought that around the same time the Isthmian Games were founded. They were held every 2 years in honor of the god Poseidon, whereas the Olympic ones were held every 4 years and in honor of Zeus. Originally, the winners of the various athletic and musical competitions would receive a wreath of wild celery. However, by Roman times they'd been changed into pine, which was considered sacred to the god of the sea. The games were open to all Greeks, but were especially popular with the Athenians, who would reward their victorious citizens with an extra 100 drachmas and even sent contestants in times of war with Corinth. Eventually, the Romans were also allowed to participate, and the games continued to be held until they were suppressed as a pagan ritual in the late 4th century AD. Over the following century, silver coins were introduced, and a new temple of Apollo, parts of which are still standing, was constructed. During this period, Corinth continued being one of the leading Greek states. They had a strong army, considered by Herodotus as the second best fighters after the Athenians, and are thought to have been the ones who first developed the trireme. They also repeatedly served as a mediator between different cities and established an alliance with Sparta. Most famously though, the city was known as a place of great luxury, and it was said that not everyone is able to go to Corinth. Embodying this was the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, which employed over 1,000 hetairas, or temple prostitutes. The most famous of them was Lais. She was thought to have been the most beautiful woman of her time and charged enormous fees for her favors. Fittingly enough, considering its reputation for luxury, Corinth was also the place where the last and most exuberant of the Greek orders of architecture was developed. Whereas the Doric order is said to symbolize a man and the Ionic a woman, the Corinthian order resembles the shape of a maiden. According to the Roman architect Vitruvius, it came to be as follows. A young girl from Corinth caught a disease and passed away. After her funeral, a basket containing various things that she'd liked when alive was placed by her tomb, and in order that they might remain longer, exposed as they were to the weather, the basket was covered with a tile. As it happened though, the basket had been placed upon the root of an acanthus, and when spring arrived, it began to grow up around it. Then one day, the famous sculptor Callimachus happened to pass by and noticed the basket. Pleased with the style and novelty of the grouping, he made columns for the Corinthians on this model and fixed the proportions. 100 years after the overthrow of the last tyrant, Corinth would be the host of a conference which, together with other ones held in Sparta, established the Hellenic League. This was an alliance of Greek city-states made to defend against the mighty Persian Empire, which at this time stretched from the Indus River Valley to the Aegean Sea. The Persians had attempted to subdue the Greeks 10 years earlier, but had been miraculously beaten back by the Athenians. This time, however, they arrived with a far greater force and were determined to win. The Corinthians sent a force of 400 soldiers to the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartan king Leonidas famously fought to his death. They also contributed by supplying 40 warships to the Battle of Salamis and some 5,000 hoplites to the Battle of Plataea, by which the Persians were finally driven out of Greece. This wouldn't be the last major conflict to involve Corinth, however. In 435 BC, they became embroiled in a war with Corcyra over the city of Epidamnos, now known as Durrës and located in Albania. Both sides happened to have powerful navies, and the Athenians, afraid that their victorious Corinth might become an unstoppable naval power, were persuaded to enter a defensive alliance with the Corcyraeans 2 years later. This in turn triggered the far greater conflict known as the Peloponnesian War, which, through 2 major alliances, one led by Athens and one led by Sparta, would involve nearly the entire Greek world. The 2 powers had been at war before, but it ended inconclusively with a truce meant to last for 30 years. However, the Athenian alliance with Corcyra led them to breaking the treaty and to resumed hostilities. The result of the war was a decisive victory for the Spartans, but the Corinthians, who had been on the winning side, were dissatisfied with the new Spartan hegemony and switched sides, allying themselves with Athens instead. This led to a new conflict known as the Corinthian War, which lasted from 395 to 387 BC, and pitted a coalition of Thebes, Athens, Corinth, and Argos, backed up by the Persian Empire, against Sparta. Initially, the Spartans won a number of land battles, but failed to capitalize on them and met a major setback by losing their fleet. However, when the Athenians began to recapture a number of islands that they had lost in the Peloponnesian War, the Persians decided to support Sparta instead, forcing the coalition to sign a peace. The treaty gave the Persians control of the Greek cities in Anatolia, and for Corinth it made being reincorporated into the Spartan alliance. It wasn't long before hostilities erupted once more between Athens and Sparta, and eventually this infighting would pave the way for a new power to rise. By 337 BC, the Macedonians, led by Philip II, had, with the exception of Sparta, subjugated the southern Greek states and united them under the League of Corinth. As hegemon, or leader of the League's army, Philip soon announced plans to invade Persia, but died before much could come out of it. This would instead be left to his son, Alexander. During the time of Alexander's successors, Greece became contested ground, with Corinth occasionally being the battleground for contests between the Antigonids based in Macedonia and other Hellenistic powers. In around 253 BC, the governor of Corinth, also called Alexander, attempted to challenge Macedonian rule and declared independence with himself as tyrant of the city. However, he was poisoned in 247, and Corinth was retaken by the Antigonids soon afterwards. 4 years later, the city's fortress of Acrocorinth was captured by Aratus of Sicyon. He was the leader of the Achaean League, a confederation of Peloponnesian city-states, and soon convinced the Corinthians to join it. After being captured once again by the Macedonians some 20 years later, Corinth was permanently brought into the League following a Roman intervention in 197. Over the coming 50 years, Corinth enjoyed a large degree of autonomy, with on matters of foreign policy, war, and federal taxes being decided jointly by the League. The confederation was headed by an annually elected general who was forbidden to serve for 2 consecutive terms. Apart from being a military leader, he also headed the League's administrative board, whose 10 members in turn presided over the various city-states' representative councils and assemblies. These bodies of citizenry could then vote on matters submitted to them by the general, with the various assemblies having a minimum voting age of 30. The Achaean League made its end with the Roman invasion of 146 BC. Led by Lucius Mummius, Corinth was captured, and after all the men had been killed and the women and children sold into slavery, the city was burned to the ground. For the next 100 years, Corinth was almost entirely uninhabited, only being refounded by Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Under the Romans, Corinth would re-emerge as a major city with impressive new temples, basilicas, and amphitheaters. But as Pausanias wrote in the 2nd century AD, Corinth is no longer inhabited by any of the old Corinthians, but by colonists sent out by the Romans.